Greetings to all our viewers tuning in to our channel. Today in Ottawa, there was no scene that screamed of a turning point. No blaring sirens, no banners, no flashing red headlines on giant screens. The meeting room held onto its familiar air of quiet seriousness, the hallmark of Canadian politics, where everything is usually weighed with care before being spoken aloud. But it was in that seemingly ordinary setting that something unusual took place. Quiet yet profound, powerful enough to shake the assumptions that have underpinned North American relations for decades. When Mark Carney stepped up to the podium, few in the room expected to witness anything beyond the bounds of a typical budget presentation. People anticipated numbers, projections, and the usual commitments on growth, inflation, and public spending. His voice was calm, his pace deliberate, no different from the technocratic speeches Ottawa is known for. Until he paused, just briefly, and then delivered a sentence so simple it was almost bare. We will no longer ask for permission. No one clapped, no one whispered. Silence spread like an invisible wave. Not because the statement was confrontational, but because it touched a deeper layer, a psychological habit embedded in Canadian policy over generations. The habit that every major move by Ottawa, no matter how carefully calculated, ultimately had to be made within the long shadow of Washington. The habit that autonomy always had an unspoken boundary, one defined by the interests and reactions of the United States. What gave the statement its weight wasn't that Canada was defying America, but that it chose not to play the familiar game. The game that Donald Trump defined during his years in power, a political arena where everything could flip in an instant, where tariffs became whips, unpredictability was wielded like a psychological weapon, and allies were forced to respond in a state of constant tension. In that game, the one who holds the upper hand isn't necessarily the strongest. It's the one others need the most. Mark Carney didn't directly challenge Donald Trump. He didn't use sharp language or set up an image of confrontation. Instead, he did something more subtle, and perhaps more dangerous. He acted as if that game was no longer the center of gravity. In doing so, he sent a cold but unmistakable message that Canada is now prepared for a future where familiar threats no longer have the power to shape their path. This moment, then, wasn't a crescendo of emotion. It was the culmination of a long process, like the soft crack when a massive sheet of ice begins to fracture. Outwardly, all seems calm, but inside, the old structure has lost its integrity. And when that structure begins to falter, the entire logic of power built around it starts to lose its foundation. At this point, the biggest question is no longer what Canada will do next, but rather, what has Donald Trump's strategy truly created over the past years? Has that calculated chaos, instead of binding allies tighter, actually pushed them to quietly chart their own exit? And if so, then today's moment in Ottawa isn't just an isolated statement. It's a sign that a familiar order is entering a phase of slow collapse, brought on by the very way it was run. For years, observers in Washington saw Donald Trump's unpredictability not as a weakness, but as the very core of his power. Each morning, the world had no idea what might appear on his social media: a new tariff threat, a sudden reversal in negotiations, or a comment capable of shaking global financial markets. That very uncertainty was treated as a strategic tool, keeping both adversaries and allies constantly on edge, but never straying too far from the path laid out by the White House. For Canada, this strategy hit deeper than for almost any other country. The two economies are so intertwined they're nearly inseparable, from industrial supply chains, energy and agriculture, to millions of jobs directly or indirectly tied to the U.S. market. In that context, every threat of tariffs on aluminum, steel, or lumber wasn't just a trade dispute. It felt more like a power-laden reminder that the door to the world's largest market could slam shut at any moment, and Ottawa would be the first to feel the shock. Trump's team believed that fear alone would be enough to keep Canada in check, that when faced with the risk of losing markets, losing jobs, and losing growth, the Canadian government would eventually return to the negotiating table in a weakened position and that willing to concede in exchange for short-term stability. Chaos, then, was used as a kind of psychological leverage, leaving the other side no time or space to build alternative plans. But what that strategy failed to consider was the long-term effect of prolonged instability. When risk becomes a permanent condition, it no longer paralyzes. It starts to awaken a structural instinct for self-preservation. For Canada, every tariff shock, every derailed negotiation didn't just cause immediate harm, it also planted a lingering question. If this dependence continues, how many other national decisions will ultimately be out of our hands? It was in the quiet between those waves of chaos that Ottawa began to think differently. Not through knee-jerk reactions or bold statements meant to counter Trump in the media, but through a much quieter process. How can tariffs be made less lethal as a weapon? How can threats from Washington be reduced to just another variable, not the deciding factor in the fate of the economy? Mark Carney understood well that you can't defeat a chaos-based strategy by creating even more chaos. Tariffs can't be neutralized through endless tit-for-tat retaliation. The only way is to render the logic of the entire game irrelevant. Once dependency is dismantled, the natural leverage disappears. And that is the great paradox of Donald Trump's strategy. In trying to force partners into deeper dependence, he instead pushed them to seriously consider breaking free from it. Calculated chaos, over time, no longer instills fear. It prompts preparation. Preparation for a world where sudden shocks are no longer enough to cripple the entire system. Looking back on that process, the speech in Ottawa no longer seems like an emotional reaction to Trump. It was the unveiling of a strategy that had been in the works for a long time. A strategy that didn't begin with bold declarations of independence, but with very practical questions about budgets, about investment, about supply chains, and about Canada's ability to stand on its own. And it's at this point that the story shifts. Because to escape the game of chaos, Canada doesn't need slogans. It needs tools. It doesn't need confrontation. It needs foundations. What followed in that speech, wrapped in the guise of a technocratic budget, was in fact a shift from reaction to initiative, from defense to restructuring. From an economy used to adapting to external shocks, Canada began turning its budget into a declaration of a new kind of sovereignty, economic sovereignty. When Mark Carney said, "It is now official," the words sounded like routine bureaucracy, a neutral opener, typical of budget language. But that calm delivery concealed something far greater. What was being made official wasn't just a set of spending items or investment priorities. It was a fundamental shift in mindset. Canada no longer sees its economy as a natural extension of the American system, but as an independent entity that must be redesigned from the ground up. For decades, Canada's budgets were shaped by adjustments to global economic cycles, to the US market, to external risks. But this time, the tone was different. The budget was no longer a reactive tool. It had become a proactive blueprint, not to patch up an old system, but to build a new structure, one where economic self-determination takes center stage. Mark Carney didn't speak with emotion or slogans. He spoke through cold, hard numbers. But those numbers told a clear story. They revealed the risks of relying too heavily on a single market. They showed the cost Canada bears every time U.S. trade policy abruptly shifts. And more importantly, they exposed a difficult truth. The stability Ottawa thought it had was actually built on the fragile foundation of goodwill from outside its borders. At the heart of this budget was housing, an issue that might seem purely social. But the deeper you looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about giving people a place to live. Behind the construction projects lay the outline of a new economic model, a new kind of federal entity leveraging public land, low-interest loans, and large-scale projects to drive industrialized housing production. Construction times are shortened, costs are lowered, emissions are controlled. But the greatest value doesn't lie in those metrics. The real strategic shift is this. Canada is proving that it can launch nationwide programs without waiting on capital, materials, or approval from Washington. In the past, many of Ottawa's big decisions weren't delayed due to lack of ideas, but due to a lack of reassurance from the U.S. market. Now, Carney is reversing that logic. He's no longer asking whether the United States agrees. He's asking whether Canada has the capacity to act on its own. And the answer comes through the budget itself. From housing, the message spreads to infrastructure, clean energy, manufacturing, and high tech. Investments are no longer designed to optimize exports to the U.S., but to strengthen domestic capability. Value chains are being pulled inward, Canadian businesses are placed at the center. The budget, therefore, isn't just a collection of expenditures. It's a quiet declaration that Canada's economy will no longer operate on the assumption that the American market is always open and always stable. This moment marks the end of a familiar mindset, the mindset of waiting for a new trade deal, waiting for tariffs to ease, waiting for political shifts in Washington. Carney made it clear, even if he didn't use those exact words, that the era of waiting has reached its limit. In a world of constant upheaval, waiting is no longer caution, it's a risk. But for such a major pivot to gain broad acceptance, numbers and policies alone aren't enough. A nation isn't run solely by budgets, it's also shaped by the story it tells itself. And this is where Mark Carney began to do something that seemed unrelated to economics. He turned to history, not to dwell in nostalgia, but to strengthen the psychological foundation for change. When a society is reminded that it once existed, traded, and thrived before today's power structures were even formed, the idea of autonomy no longer feels foreign or dangerous. From the budget, the narrative began to expand into identity, and from cold statistics, it moved to a deeper level, where history becomes a strategic tool to legitimize and energize the path Canada has now chosen. When Mark Carney unexpectedly turned to history in a speech that was expected to be strictly economic, many initially assumed it was just a symbolic flourish, a rhetorical prelude. But the way he chose his historical reference and the precise moment he delivered it made clear this was no offhand gesture. It was part of a strategy, because in times of major transition, numbers may persuade markets, but only history has the power to calm the collective psyche. He spoke of Canada as a nation born from indigenous communities and explorers, from trading networks that stretched across the continent long before the modern borders of North America were drawn. This wasn't about taking credit or stirring up hollow national pride. It was meant to dismantle a long-standing assumption that Canada's development was the inevitable outcome of standing next to the United States. Carney subtly flipped that logic. He showed that Canada is not the byproduct of a superpower, but a historical entity with its own proven capacity for organization and connection, long before today's global order ever existed. In contrast to Donald Trump's use of history, often wielded to provoke confrontation, deepen divisions, and promote an exclusionary brand of nationalism, Carney's storytelling created a stark divergence. Trump uses the past to build walls. Carney uses it to open roads. He didn't speak of Canada as a nation oppressed, or as one that fought against a specific enemy. He spoke of Canada's ability to adapt, to build, to sustain vital networks in the harshest of conditions. The unspoken message was clear. If our ancestors could do that in far tougher times, there's no reason for this generation to believe that autonomy is some distant or naive fantasy. Mark Carney understands that history, when told the right way, can become a kind of strategic weapon. It doesn't strike head-on, but it reshapes how a society sees risk and sees itself. For years, economic dependence on the U.S. was justified by fear of losing access, jobs, or stability. The history Carney invoked doesn't erase those risks, but reframes them. In that frame, risk isn't synonymous with failure. It's a necessary condition for every bold step forward. This moment also served as an indirect response to Donald Trump. Trump built power by making partners believe they had no alternative. Carney dismantled that belief by reminding people that choices have always existed. The only question is whether we have the confidence to see and pursue them. When history is used to rebuild confidence in a nation's own capacities, psychological dependence begins to crack, and with it, the foundations of familiar leverage. But history alone cannot replace policy. It can only open the door to awareness. The next step requires action, decisive enough to turn belief into operating structure. And Carney knew full well that if the story ended with memory and identity, it would soon be dismissed as a beautiful but harmless narrative. That's why, right after revisiting historical foundations, he pivoted to what observers had been waiting for: how to turn that spirit of autonomy into the governing principle of the modern state. No longer a question of who Canada was in the past, but who it will prioritize, what it will prioritize, and how it will prioritize here and now. History had served its role, legitimizing the bold step to come. And from that point, the story moved into a new phase, where a slogan that once seemed simple began to take shape as a concrete structure of power: Canada First. When Mark Carney invoked the phrase, Canada First, the atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. Not because the phrase was unfamiliar, but because it was all too familiar, in a very different context. For years, the world had heard America First as a declaration of confrontation, a slogan laced with withdrawal and imposition. But Carney used the same linguistic structure in a completely different way, not to close doors, but to reorder priorities. Not to shock, but to redefine how the Canadian state operates from within. The key difference was that Canada First wasn't introduced as a campaign slogan or a media soundbite. It was presented as an operational principle. From now on, every federal dollar would carry an implicit question: does this value stay within the Canadian economy? No longer a matter of if convenient, it would be the first box that must be checked. It was this quiet shift that made many realize this wasn't a symbolic statement, but the beginning of a genuine economic restructuring. For decades, Canada had been accustomed to openness, opening up to attract capital, to join global supply chains, to optimize short-term efficiency. That approach brought growth and stability, but also an under-discussed consequence. Decision-making power slowly diffused outward. When major infrastructure projects depend on foreign contractors, when key supply chains lie beyond national borders, every external shock has the potential to ripple deep into the domestic system. Canada First emerged as a direct response to that reality. Carney wasn't calling for the exclusion of foreign partners, he was calling for a reset of priorities. Canadian steel comes first. Canadian-built railways become the default. Housing led by domestic companies is no longer a secondary option. It becomes a pillar. In defense, infrastructure, manufacturing, energy, everything is now viewed through the lens of internal capacity before being opened up externally. When applied across the board, this principle doesn't just create jobs or stimulate growth, it changes how the economy absorbs external pressure. Here, the contrast with Donald Trump's approach becomes most apparent. Trump wielded America First as a bludgeon, forcing others to concede through threats of retreat. Carney uses Canada First as a cushion, allowing Canada's economy to steady no matter how often Washington shifts tone. No need for retaliation, no need for escalation. When the structure changes, the old levers lose their power on their own. Mark Carney understands that power in the 21st century isn't just about exerting pressure, it's about absorbing shock. The more an economy draws on its own capacities, the less vulnerable it becomes to political turbulence from abroad. Canada First, then, isn't isolation, it's foundational strength. And when the foundation is strong, cooperation and competition alike become more deliberate, more on your own terms. The most important outcome of this shift is a reversal in the psychological balance. In the past, every tariff threat from Washington triggered waves of anxiety in Ottawa and the provinces. Now, with value chains brought home, those threats lose weight. You can't threaten tariffs on a partner who's minimized their dependence on you. When the flow is rerouted at the source, the echo of coercion fades into empty space. But Carney was careful not to turn Canada First into a rigid doctrine. He knows no modern economy survives in isolation. The issue is not whether to cooperate, but from what position. And it's here that the new structure begins to show its most powerful effect. When Canada is no longer fighting to protect the survival of each industry in every round of negotiations, it enters the room with a very different mindset. That's when Canada First reveals its true role. Not to replace negotiation, but to reshape the starting point of negotiation. Once you've built a domestic alternative, every discussion with foreign partners becomes a strategic choice, not a lifeline. You can say yes without fearing dependence. And more importantly, you can say no without harming yourself. From this structure, a tangible lesson begins to emerge. Not from the big stages or the high-tech sectors, but in a field seen as traditional and most vulnerable, the lumber industry. It is here that the Canada First approach is put to the harshest test, and it is here that the country witnesses what negotiation from a position of strength truly looks like, when your options are no longer locked behind a single door. The lumber industry is where every theory of economic sovereignty faces its harshest test, not because it's small, but because it's deeply rooted in dependence. For decades, Canadian wood flowed south as if by nature, sustaining communities in British Columbia, Quebec, and New Brunswick. It created jobs, brought in foreign currency, and forged a deep bond with the U.S. market. When everything ran smoothly, that dependence was called an advantage. But every time a trade dispute erupted, it quickly revealed itself as a vulnerability. When the question of New Brunswick's forestry sector came up, the mood in the room grew noticeably heavier. 75% of its export volume depends on the United States, not an abstract figure, but thousands of families, dozens of small towns, and an entire regional economy that could be thrown into turmoil by a single tariff decision from Washington. In the past, such moments typically triggered a familiar reflex: seek to appease, wait for a deal, hope the storm would pass. But this time, Mark Carney chose a different path. He didn't sidestep the reality, nor did he paint an easy picture. He acknowledged plainly that the dependency is real, and because of that, it must be treated as a strategic risk, not an unchangeable condition. His approach wasn't about emotional reassurance. It felt more like a cold dissection, with each choice laid bare alongside its full consequences. The first option: increase domestic consumption. It sounds simple, but for an industry long used to exporting, it's a complete reversal of mindset. It requires public procurement policies, infrastructure planning, and housing initiatives to be restructured to absorb homegrown supply. The second option: diversify global markets, not by chasing every opportunity, but by deliberately building long-term relationships with partners who don't use tariffs as political weapons. And the third, most important option: increase the value of the product. Lumber must no longer be sold simply as raw material vulnerable to price pressure, but as part of a higher value chain, harder to replace, harder to dismiss. What's striking isn't any one option in isolation, but how all three are placed alongside continued negotiations with the US. Carney didn't announce a retreat from the table. On the contrary, he emphasized that Canada is still negotiating, but from a different position, no longer negotiating out of fear of losing the market, but with preparations already in place for the possibility of losing it. That difference might seem subtle, but it shifts the entire balance of power. Donald Trump believed tariffs were the ultimate lever, but a lever only works when the other side has no alternative. Once Canada builds domestic capacity, opens new global doors, and upgrades the value of its production, every threat from Washington starts to lose its decisive edge. It's no longer a hanging sentence, just another variable in a long-term equation. The lesson from the lumber industry, then, extends far beyond a traditional sector. It shows what 21st century negotiating power looks like, not through tough talk, not through public confrontation, but through the quiet creation of alternatives. When you have options, you don't need to win with words. Just not being cornered is already a game changer. And it's here that the philosophy Carney is pursuing comes into full view. Sovereignty is not about cutting ties, it's about withstanding pressure. It's not about turning your back on the world, it's about stepping into it without trembling. The lumber industry, with all its fragility, has become living proof that when a nation prepares thoroughly enough, negotiation is no longer a survival struggle, it becomes a strategic choice, made calmly and with confidence. At last, when all the numbers had been read and every policy laid out, Mark Carney closed with a line that seemed almost ordinary. These are things we don't need anyone's permission to do. No dramatic emphasis, no emotional crescendo, but it was that very calmness that gave the words their weight. Because this wasn't a challenge directed outward, it was a quiet affirmation directed inward. Canada has reached a point where confidence no longer needs to be proven through confrontation. For years, power in international relations has often been defined as the ability to make others need you. Donald Trump mastered that logic, turning tariffs, market access, and unpredictability into instruments of pressure. But what just happened in Ottawa reveals a different logic taking shape. In a world defined by volatility, true power belongs to those who need less. Those who can say no without collapsing. Those who can wait without panic. Those who can negotiate without gambling their survival. Mark Carney didn't declare victory over the United States, nor did he try to replace one order with a new, oppositional one. What he did was methodically dismantle layers of dependency, both economic and psychological, so that Canada would no longer react to the rhythms set by others. When need is removed, threats lose their force. When options open up, fear recedes. And when the structure changes, power doesn't have to shout, it simply operates. This moment, then, is not just Canada's story. It's a signal to many other middle powers around the world. In an age where economic pressure is increasingly weaponized by superpowers, the question is no longer how to fight back. It's how to avoid being forced into the fight in the first place. A nation's maturity isn't shown by who speaks the loudest, but by who prepares well enough not to be forced to speak at all. When Carney left that room, he didn't leave behind a controversial slogan. He left behind a new state of mind. One in which Canada no longer defines itself by how it responds to Trump, but by what it chooses to build for itself. It marked the end of an era of psychological dependency and the beginning of a phase where sovereignty is no longer a promise, but a daily practice. And for us, this story raises a compelling question. In today's world, what does real strength look like? Is it the power to exert the most pressure, or the ability to remain standing when that pressure comes? What do you think of the path Canada is taking? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if you found this analysis thought-provoking, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into global geopolitics in the weeks ahead.